He was the most controversial diplomat of the 20th century, a man praised as a strategic genius and condemned as an architect of unending conflict. Henry Kissinger, the German Jewish refugee who fled Nazi persecution, rose to become America's most influential foreign policy mind. His words shaped wars, ended others, redrew borders, and forever altered the way global power is understood. To some, he was a realist who kept a dangerous world from collapsing. To others, he was the cold engineer of secret bombings, covert deals, and moral ambiguity. But behind the steel-edged intellect, behind the Nobel Prize and the political firestorms, stood another Henry Kissinger, a father. And in the long shadow of his towering, polarizing legacy, lived two children, Elizabeth Kissinger and David Kissinger. They carried a name recognized around the world, yet grew up in the private turbulence of a man whose life was consumed by strategy, diplomacy, crisis, and consequence. Their childhoods unfolded between global tension and domestic distance. They watched their father navigate superpowers, but struggle with family, shape peace accords, but miss milestones, analyze nations, but overlook the quiet moments at home. Yet both children, in their own way, learned to understand the complexity of the man the world refused to see fully. Tonight, we step beyond geopolitics into the world Kissinger rarely revealed, the story of a father's divided life, and the two children who inherited not his power, but his shadow. Number 2. Elizabeth Kissinger. Elizabeth Kissinger, born in 1959, was Henry Kissinger's first child, the daughter who spent her earliest years watching her father rise from Harvard intellectual to one of the most influential figures in the world. As the Vietnam War escalated, as détente reshaped the Cold War, as secret negotiations unfolded behind closed doors, Elizabeth was growing up in a home where history never rested, and her father rarely stayed still. Unlike the public man surrounded by cameras, advisors, and diplomats, the private Henry Kissinger was quiet, analytical, and emotionally distant, a man shaped by the trauma of fleeing Nazi Germany and the cultural reserve of his immigrant upbringing. Elizabeth felt this distance early. She grew up in Cambridge and later in Washington, in households defined by tense schedules, state calls, and the relentless hum of global crisis. Yet Elizabeth was not overshadowed by the weight of her father's reputation. She developed her own identity far from the political arena. In a family where power was constantly in motion, she chose stability. She pursued a private, academically grounded life, gravitating towards psychology and social sciences, not geopolitics. She built a career helping people understand their inner battles, rather than the battles between nations. Those who knew her described Elizabeth as empathetic, introspective, and grounded, traits that stood in stark contrast to the hard-edged realism of her father's worldview. She was the emotional counterpoint to the Kissinger household, the quiet presence who watched her father become a global symbol while protecting her own sense of self from the glare of international controversy. Growing up during Watergate, the fall of Saigon, and foreign policy storms that defined the 1970s, Elizabeth experienced the side of geopolitics the public never saw. The security details, the journalists outside the home, the tension that filled the air whenever the phone rang. She learned early that fame was not glamorous. It was invasive, demanding, and exhausting. She also witnessed the deterioration of her parents' marriage. Henry's long hours, constant travel, and consuming responsibilities strained the home. After her parents divorced in 1964, Elizabeth split her life between two worlds: the structured, intellectual gravity of her father and the emotional steadiness of her mother, Anne Fleischer. As an adult, Elizabeth chose privacy over prominence. She did not build a public persona, did not capitalize on her father's fame, and avoided the political spotlight entirely. While Henry Kissinger shaped nations, Elizabeth shaped her own quiet existence, anchored in empathy rather than strategy. Among Henry Kissinger's two children, Elizabeth is the emotional compass, the daughter who grew up in the long shadow of global diplomacy yet forged a life defined not by geopolitics, but by humanity. Number 1. David Kissinger. David Kissinger, born in 1961, entered the world just as his father's ascent into the highest levels of American power began to accelerate. While Henry Kissinger was shaping the geopolitical map of the 20th century, negotiating with world leaders and navigating crises that filled newspaper front pages, David was living the quieter, often lonely life of a child whose father belonged not just to a family, but to history itself. If Elizabeth inherited her father's introspection, David inherited his sharpness. He grew up in Cambridge and later Washington, spending his childhood in a house where foreign policy was discussed as casually as weather, and where world events competed with family life for Henry's attention. Protective details, intrusion from the press, and the constant rotation of political elites at the dinner table became part of David's everyday reality. But David's upbringing carried another layer of complexity. He was old enough to watch the world turn his father into a symbol. Celebrated by some as a brilliant strategist, condemned by others as the architect of morally fraught Realpolitik. As the Vietnam War dragged on, as Cambodia and Chile ignited controversy, as Kissinger became one of the most polarizing figures in American history, David had to learn what it meant to grow up in the shadow of a global debate. Unlike many children of political figures, David did not recoil from the world his father occupied. Instead, he absorbed its complexities and learned how to navigate both the intellectual and emotional contradictions of a famously enigmatic parent. He attended Yale, gravitating toward writing, analysis, and storytelling. Not diplomacy, but the interpretation of the world around him. David eventually moved into the entertainment industry, carving out a career that blended intellect with cultural influence. As an executive at NBC Universal Television Studios, he helped shepherd major television productions, proving that a Kissinger could shape global narratives from outside the halls of power. Later, he founded Conoco, Conan O'Brien's production company, further embedding himself into the world of media and storytelling. His writing, especially his New York Times essays about his father, reveals a son who both admired and questioned the man behind the myth. David described Henry Kissinger not as the calculating strategist the world obsessed over, but as a surprisingly warm observer, a lover of history, a deeply private man shaped by trauma, and a father who tried, sometimes awkwardly, to connect with a world he had never quite felt at ease within. David's life represents an evolution of the Kissinger legacy, away from war rooms and statecraft and toward culture, narrative, and reflection. He became his father's quiet interpreter, offering the world glimpses into the private humanity of a man so often defined only by his public decisions. Among Henry Kissinger's two children, David is the chronicler, the son who translated the weight of a geopolitical titan into personal understanding, and who built a life not around global power, but around the power of story. The legacy of Henry Kissinger and his two children is a story divided between the global and the intimate, between the grand stage of world politics and the fragile terrain of family life. Kissinger's public persona was sharp-edged, formidable, and endlessly debated. But the man the world argued about was not the man Elizabeth and David knew at home. Their lives reveal the private cost of living alongside a figure whose influence stretched across continents, conflicts, and generations. Henry Kissinger's diplomatic career reshaped the 20th century. His work defined wars, armistices, secret negotiations, and the tense balance between superpowers. Yet his personal life unfolded in quieter tones. A man shaped by exile, burdened by trauma, and consumed by statecraft. His children grew up not with the myth, but with the man. Brilliant, distant, introspective, and often unreachable under the weight of history. Elizabeth Kissinger, sensitive and thoughtful, became the emotional mirror of the family. the daughter who observed her father's contradictions with compassion rather than judgment. She chose a life far from power, grounding herself in human connection rather than geopolitical strategy. Through her, we see the softer silhouette of Kissinger, a man capable of warmth but overshadowed by the demands of global crisis. David Kissinger, analytical and sharp, carved his own place in the world by shaping stories rather than shaping nations. He stepped outside the realm of diplomacy and into media, writing, and television. A subtle continuation of his father's legacy, translating complex human realities into narratives the world could understand. David carried his father's intellect, but tempered it with humanity, offering rare insight into the private man behind the public titan. Together, Elizabeth and David reveal what history often forgets: that even the most powerful figures are fathers first, imperfect and human. Their lives reflect the invisible battles fought behind the scenes, the struggle to reconcile public duty with private presence, and to grow up under a name that belongs as much to the world as to a family. Henry Kissinger's global legacy will be debated for centuries, but the legacy of Henry Kissinger, the father, lives in two children who found their own identities beyond power, beyond controversy, beyond the weight of his name. Their story proves that, even in the orbit of world-altering decisions, the most enduring legacies are often the human ones. The quiet resilience, the search for understanding, and the courage to build a different life in the shadow of a giant.